Thank you so much for being here at our weekly webinar where we look at the major weather factors that are going to be impactful on your portfolio over the next few weeks and months. And so today in particular, we're going to focus on weather impacts on agricultural markets. To introduce myself and my special guest today, I am Dr. Hansi Singh. I'm CEO and co-founder of Planet AI. I'm an Earth Systems scientist, a former fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy, and I used to be a professor. My guest today is Dinesh Thogalua, who is a specialist in capital markets, very specifically commodities markets. And so, in his past lives, he's worked as an ag tech entrepreneur with boots on the ground, going and talking to farmers around the world. And then he has also spent time at NVIDIA as an engineer. So he is a man of multiple talents. And today he will be talking specifically about agriculture. So, before we get started, I am going to say something about the long range forecasting, which we are going to go over the implications of the long range forecast for winter crops. And so, in order to just kind of set the stage for that, when it comes to long range forecasting, the way that we do it is that instead of using a weather model, which relies only on the atmosphere and can only predict up to 14 days because the atmosphere has a limited memory, for much longer range forecasting, we use Earth system models. And Earth system models are much more comprehensive models of the Earth system. They include not only the atmosphere, but also the ocean, the land, the ice, all of which have much longer memories than the atmosphere. And so this really helps us extend the horizon that we can look towards when it comes to forecasting and understanding what weather patterns are going to look like weeks to months ahead. And just keep in mind with long range forecasts, they're not magic. So I can't tell you, for example, if you're going to have a white Christmas, but I can tell you, for example, weather conditions in December or even the week of Christmas, as we get closer to the Christmas holiday, are going to be conducive to snow in your region. So that is kind of the magic, but also the limitation of long range forecasting. So let's get started. So today we are specifically going to focus on the weather impacts on commodity grains, just because those are probably the largest agricultural products that are in your portfolio, and they are exquisitely sensitive to the weather, as most agricultural products are. So we will present a couple of case studies, including talking about corn, then about wheat. There was a lot going on in sort of 2010 to 2013. So we will be covering that sort of weather adventure with you and how it impacted those particular grains. And then we will go into highlights of the current forecast, looking into this coming winter and then the following spring. To get started, I'd like to first talk about what we know to be the Goldilocks zone for commodity grains. So, all plants, including grains, have kind of an optimum temperature range at which they grow well or reproduce well. So, these are what are called response curves for either growth right here or reproduction right here. So basically flowering and pollination. And you can see for all of them, it is shaped sort of like a bell. And what that means is that you just need kind of very perfect conditions for this optimum. So temperatures can't be too hot. So if temperatures are too hot, then the enzymes that are necessary for growth or for reproduction are not working well. And same when those enzymes are too cold. When they're too cold, they're just not fast enough and they sort of are sluggish. And so what this means is that, we have this sort of like not too hot, not too cold optimum, which is referred to as sort of a Goldilocks zone of perfect conditions for growth. When it comes to rainfall, it is also somewhat of a Goldilocks problem for any kind of crop, particularly grains. So, first of all, we want optimal rainfall that is, first of all, frequent, right? Because we don't want the soils to dry out, but also not too frequent. And if it is too frequent, then diseases can take hold and the soil can get waterlogged. Let's talk about rain intensity. We want rain that is sufficiently intense so that the rainfall actually penetrates the soil and it doesn't just sort of run off immediately. But at the same time, if rainfall is too intense, then it can wash away seedlings, it can even wash away flowers, and it can wash away pollen. It can damage leaves, it can leave soils waterlogged, and then you get the same issues with disease. So it is kind of a very sort of perfect amount of rain that is necessary to keep these plants happy and to make harvests optimal. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dinesh to give us some highlights on more specifics on the stages of growth for grain.
Thanks, Hansi. Today, I want to focus on weather impacts on grains. And Hansi has already touched upon how weather impacts all crops, which is somewhat obvious. But the reason I want to focus on the grains is that grains are very popular commodities, and weather impacts on grains can register in the future settlement prices. And I would like to first talk about the general idea of how weather impacts the grains, and then we'll take two cases, one with corn and one with wheat. And in those examples, we look at the settlement prices, future settlement prices, and actually see how intensely weather impacted those prices. To start with, some of the things that are common across all the four grains. Four grains here meaning soybean, corn, winter wheat, and spring wheat, is that during the planting season, you need to have the ground should be tillable, which means if it is too dry or too cold, you cannot till the ground. And if it is so, what farmers do is to wait for a couple of rains to happen, and then the weather to be warm enough for them to start planting in the season. And then as the season goes, rainfall becomes an important factor throughout the season, because if there is drought, it doesn't matter what crop you put in, usually you will get lower yields if there is a drought. And during the harvesting too, rain has an impact on uh, when you actually harvest the crop and also on the spreading of disease. I think it's better to talk through these different impacts with using an example. So let's go to the next slide where we look at the future settlement prices of corn in CBOT and CME, basically. So what you're looking at in this graph is that for the last 25 years, what the price movements of futures has been for corn, right, on CME. So as we go from left to right, the first pic that captures our eyes is the drought in the 1995. And as you can see, people before 1995, if you were in 1993 or 1992, you probably wouldn't have imagined that the price would go beyond $3 per bushel, which is sort of the average, right? And you can look at that, it's already spiked all the way to $5.50 per bushel. So because of the drought, the price spikes, and then when the next season begins, they see that, okay, it looks like the season is underway under normal conditions, so the price starts coming down. And then nothing happens for quite some time until we see something that happens in 2008 is not related to weather. The spike that you see in 2008 is not related to weather. It's related to the financial markets crashing and interest rates spiking and other factors, basically. But what happens after that is the most important story that I want to talk about today, is how weather throughout the globe has impacted corn prices, starting with a drought in Russia in 2010. And what happens is Russia and Ukraine see lower harvests and of their wheat crop, and that has impact on the corn prices because wheat and corn are substitutes with each other in some cases. So that starts the spike in the corn prices. But what happens is that the spike carries on, and the United States is the largest producer in corn. And what happens in the United States is that the planting season gets delayed because of heavy rains, and which is also not good because then the seeds will not get enough oxygen when the soil is saturated, right? So the spike continues, and then during the July there is just too much heat, so people know that, oh, we're not going to have great yields. After the harvest, there is a momentary uh, uh, lowering of prices just for 9 months or so, and the next season there is a severe drought throughout the season, and the prices just absolutely spike, right? And what you need to remember is that because the yield has been lower in previous 2 seasons, that adds to the prices of grains in this harvest as well, because grains can be stored and sold later, which some people do, right? So what we have seen here is that in this graph, pretty much the biggest and longest spike is due to weather impact. I want to talk about the next slide where, Hansi, could we move to the next slide? Yeah. So the impact of weather on corn is what I wanted to point out is that it is not as simple as saying how much it's going to rain throughout the season, how hot it's going to be throughout the season, but you have to start paying attention to the different stages of corn growth and how weather has different impacts at different stages. Because if you think about it, in the beginning, you don't want too much rain because then the soil will be waterlogged. So the farmers are going, oh my God, why is there too much rain? But then after you plant the seeds, you want rain. So they are going, oh, please, why is there no rain? And then they do that continuously until the harvest season comes in and the pollination time comes in, where if there's too much rain, like Hansi pointed out, flowers could be knocked out, the pollens could be flushed out. So yeah, we don't want too much rain. And towards the harvest season, you're saying that the same farmer who wanted adequate rain throughout the season would be like, oh my God, there is too much moisture now. We cannot harvest the grain. So what's important is not just how much it's going to rain throughout the season, how much it's going to rain in each stage of the season. And as the second column shows in this table, the months where that happens is going to keep changing a little bit from year to year. Because if you delay the planting of the crop, obviously everything else is going to be delayed. So you have to be cognizant of that as well. Created this table because we are going to put this slide in our YouTube channel, I guess, Hansi, is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, this recording will be on YouTube. So feel free to take pictures, to do whatever you need to note this information down if you think it'll be helpful for your strategies.
Yeah, so this information is compiled from USDA, and you can come back to this again and again if you're building a model on how to use weather and get from weather all the way to commodity prices. Okay, let's move to the next
Great.
slide.
Yeah.
So to summarize, the key takeaway is that as you have seen from the spike, weather impact caused prices to rise by 100%, right? Double it. You don't even see that in short time periods in stocks. So if you're thinking commodity trading is not as lucrative as stock trading, this clearly shows that that's not the case. And we have also seen that it is not just the quantity of rainfall that's important. The timing of rainfall is also important. I have shown, as I talked about, how different growth stages get impacted differently. And the final point is that if you knew what the weather was going to do months ahead in advance, then you can make a significant amount of money in trading those corn futures. Okay.
One little interjection I want to put in here, Dinesh, just a little
Yeah.
weather interlude. Going back here to sort of these conditions that led to this sort of double spike that we saw in 2011 to 2014. So this initial summer here in Russia, it was a really extreme summer that led to
Mm,
sort of this initial price rise. But then uh, this second sort of major drought and heat over the US, this was particularly linked to the presence of the huge Pacific blob, which is a
mm,
huge amount of warm water that was sitting over the Pacific at that time.
right.
And so there are, unfortunately, some interesting parallels to this year because we do have a blob sitting over the Pacific Ocean right now, the blob 2.0. And so from our forecast, it does look like that blob is going to sort of continue to be there, at least for the next few months. And so this is something to look out for potentially this year. So often what we look for is similarities between previous years and with similar sort of fundamentals factors in terms of the weather and what we expect this coming year. And so there are some parallels. And so I think the possibility of heat and drought coming into the spring and into the summer are really something to watch out for when it comes to grains.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, weather is so fascinating. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
And it
So
has
the
a
next
huge
story I
impact.
want to talk about is the story of wheat in 2010. I touched upon earlier, this Russian drought, right? And Russia is a major producer of wheat. Ukraine is also a major producer of wheat. And this story focuses on what actually happened in Russia at that time. And so what happened in 2010 was that there was a catastrophic heat wave that happened in Russia. And the thing is, it affected both the winter wheat that's planted in September, October period and harvested in spring, and spring wheat that goes into the ground in spring, right? We just have had the winter wheat go into the ground now, just a month ago. So as the harvest season of winter wheat approaches and the planting season of spring wheat approaches, this drought causes damage to both of them in 2010. So there is a severe impact on the wheat yield, and what happens is that they initially think, oh, it's the winter wheat that's going to be impacted. They see that the drought continued and the spring wheat is also impacted, and all of a sudden there is panic, right? And Putin at that point, basically in August, bans exports of wheat from Russia. So what that basically sends up the wheat prices because Russia basically banned. It's not just that there is lower supply of wheat due to lower yields. It's just that a big country, an important country, cuts off the supply entirely to global markets. And I think there's a funny story there. I think Putin in just before that was did he say in an interview or something, Hansi, that he's happy that there is global warming and because it's going to be warmer in Russia or something like that?
Yeah, he was like really stoked in kind of the 2000s about how warm and balmy Russia was getting. But then, sort of when you actually see, well, warm and balmy also means heat waves and drought that, absolutely kill agricultural yield and cause all sorts of other problems. I think his tune changed a little bit. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yep.
what's interesting for me to in this story is that, well, it's somewhat similar to the corn story that weather impacted the prices. But what's something new about it in this story is that what started as a weather impact suddenly converts into a geopolitical impact,
Yeah.
right? We don't think of it that way. We think that these things are all separate. We think of commodity prices being impacted by weather, geopolitics, and interest rates, but sometimes we see the weather impact converting into a geopolitical impact. So
Yeah, the
going to the
stacking
next,
of
yeah,
impacts. Yeah, it's very cool. Okay, sorry.
yeah, yeah.
Next slide.
So again, I have put two tables here. One is the impact of weather on winter wheat. The other one is on the spring wheat. The impacts are similar, but of course, the winter wheat is more tolerant of colder weathers than the spring wheat. And of course, the seasons are completely different. And again, here you will see that if there is too much rain, it delays planting. And to later half of the time, if it is if the rains are again too much, you don't want to harvest, because what happens is that if you when all these grains are standing in the crops, they're all separate and wind dries them out. So moisture is not such a big problem until there is too much rain and then disease starts spreading. But why the reason why it impacts harvest is because once you harvest these grains and put them in silos, they're all going to be touching with each other, they'll all be compacted. So moisture could cause spreading of fungus diseases and all kinds of other problems emerge because of that. So when people go for harvesting, they carry a device, they try to see how much dry it is. And if it is not too dry, they don't harvest. But sometimes you have to harvest because the crop is mature. Then they'll have to spend extra money doing artificial drying. So either way,
Mm.
it's going to impact the price of the crop. The next slide. So key takeaway here is that the weather factor could become a geopolitical factor. That for wheat particularly, heat temperature also plays a significant role, and that if there is not enough rain during the grainful stage, you're going to cause lower yields. And wetter conditions, as I explained, impacts harvest in two different ways. Either you delay the harvest or you spend more on artificial dry. Okay. I'd like to hand it
Thank
back to Hansi. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Dinesh. That is amazing information and great case studies to really illustrate the effect of weather and sometimes the really dramatic impacts of weather. So let's take a look at sort of the long range outlook for winter crops in particular this year. So, first of all, some of the fundamentals this year really favor warmer than usual conditions, and particularly in early spring. So, keep a lookout for early spring, warmer than usual winter season growing conditions. However, there is, as we talked about earlier, a real possibility of cold snaps because we have a pretty weak polar vortex right now. And so when these cold snaps happen to crops that are growing over the winter, we often see crown damage. And so, that is a factor to keep in mind that even though conditions will be warmer than usual and maybe the winter crops may be happily growing, the cold snaps might disrupt some of this extra productivity that we might expect to see. And then finally, because we're dealing with this warmer than usual winter and spring, it is possible that in the summertime we might see some of these meteorological droughts. And this is particularly because, as I said, we have this blob sitting over the Pacific and it tends to have pretty major downwind impacts. And so, particularly over North America, we see some conditions that suggest that there is a possibility of this. So, this is something else to keep in mind as we move forward over the next few months and are able to take a look into the summertime. And so, in terms of looking at winter wheat, so here are some locations where winter wheat is grown. And so, I am looking at here the springtime, and particularly in the spring, the background conditions are mostly warmer than usual. And so we might expect a early spring, and so we might expect more robust growth. However, I think it is really important once again to remember the possibility of cold snaps. And so even if the growth is great over the spring, if there are winter cold snaps or spring cold snaps, and they happen at opportune times, then we may see damage to the growing wheat. And the other really interesting thing that we're seeing sort of pop up in the forecast, so this is looking at the spring, but this was also evident in the winter. So there looks like there is some possibility of lower than average precipitation over Europe, including Eastern Europe, Britain, and France. And so I think we should really keep an eye out for this, not just in terms of winter crops, but for the coming spring and summer. And I highlight this very particularly because it is showing up in the forecasts, sort of month after month after month. And so whenever I see something like that, I know that we have to stop and pay some attention to this. So in future weeks, we will continue to keep an eye on this and think about some of the dynamics that could be driving this drying over this region. I will say that in general, the Mediterranean region is just expected to get drier as our climate warms. It's very, very, very robust. And so this could have implications for the types of crops that are grown in these regions. And, we may see more and more meteorological droughts in the summertime within these regions. So that's all we got for today. Thank you so much for being here. We really, appreciate the engagement. And next week, I'm going to be specifically talking about weather and the mining sector with a guest, Karen Chauvin, who is an expert on mining in Alberta and particularly environmental technologies that can help make mining facilities more robust. And so, particularly, we're going to look at vulnerabilities, and then we'll also talk a bit about opportunities because, mining is really critical in supply chains. And so, when mining goes down because of the weather, then it really has some important downstream impacts. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm on LinkedIn. Also feel free to email me, Hansi at planet.ai. And yeah, stay in touch. And thank you so much for being here. And we have one question that came up on the chat specifically about the blob's possible impacts on precipitation. And so, um, in particular, right, the blob, we expect most of the impacts to be over North America. However, whenever we have these kinds of like large temperature anomalous temperature patterns like this, we tend to see that the circulation around that temperature anomaly sort of adjusts. And so, because of that, that's why most of the effects tend to be downstream. But it is also possible that there are some upstream effects into Russia and the Ukraine. So, I will have to actually look a little bit more carefully at some of the meteorology there to see what some of those circulation impacts might be. But certainly we see effects over North America, and the primary impact is specifically that warming. And yes, so I really would love to get any suggestions from any folks about future webinar topics that you'd love for us to go over. So we're in the middle of winter. Weather in the winter tends to be very predictable because it is due to sort of these large scale factors that we can predict well. And so really excited to hear some ideas for what you would like to see us talk about. So thank you so much.